Hi guys, there is a quiet feeling when we imagine ancient Egypt. A feeling that does not rush. A feeling that moves slowly, like warm air over sand. Far away in time, along the long shape of the Nile River, small villages once rested under the sun. The river moved gently through the land, bringing life to fields, palms, and simple homes made of mud and straw. This is where children lived. Not in grand palaces. Not always near kings or queens. But in everyday homes, where mornings began with soft light and evenings ended in calm darkness. A child in ancient Egypt would wake up with the sun. There was no loud noise of machines. No rushing sounds of modern life. Only the quiet movement of people beginning their day. The air in the morning could feel cool near the river. Sometimes a little mist would rise above the water, slowly fading as the sun grew stronger. The homes near the river would feel peaceful at this hour, as if the world itself was still waking up gently. Inside a small house, a child might sleep on a simple mat. Not soft like modern beds, but familiar, shaped by daily use. The walls around them would be made of dried mud bricks, holding the warmth of the day before. When they woke, life did not feel complicated. There were simple tasks. Simple movements. A slow rhythm that repeated every day. A child might first sit up quietly, adjusting to the morning light coming through a small opening in the wall. The light would not be harsh yet. It would be soft, spreading slowly across the room. Nearby, a parent or older sibling might already be awake. In many homes, families moved together in the same rhythm. No one was in a hurry, but everyone had something small to do. Water might be brought in from a jar stored the night before. The air would carry the faint scent of clay, grain, or cooked bread from earlier hours. Breakfast was simple. Often bread. Sometimes fruit. Occasionally a bit of honey if the family had it. Food was not rushed. It was shared quietly, often without long conversation. Children in ancient Egypt grew up surrounded by routine. Not strict in the modern sense, but steady. Predictable. The same actions repeated each day created a kind of quiet comfort. After eating, a child might help with very small tasks. They could carry water in a small container. Or help clean a space inside the home. Sometimes they would sit nearby while adults worked, simply observing. Observation was a large part of childhood in this time. Children learned by watching. They watched how grain was stored. They watched how bread was made. They watched how tools were used, repaired, and passed from hand to hand. Even play felt connected to daily life. A child might have small handmade toys. Simple figures carved from wood or shaped from clay. Sometimes they played with stones or small objects found near the home. Games were quiet and often played in shaded areas to escape the heat of the sun. Outside, the world was warm and steady. The Nile shaped everything. Its presence was constant, like a slow heartbeat across the land. Fields stretched near its edges, where crops grew under careful attention. Farmers worked nearby, and children often saw them moving through rows of plants, especially during planting or harvest seasons. The sounds of this world were gentle. Footsteps on dry earth. The soft rustle of clothing. The distant call of birds near the river. There were no loud interruptions. Life moved at a natural pace, tied closely to the sun and water. A child growing up here would slowly become familiar with this rhythm. Not through instruction alone, but through daily experience. Morning would pass into midday. The sun would rise higher, and the air would grow warmer. During this time, many people rested in shaded areas. Homes would feel still. Even the streets between houses would quiet down. Children often stayed close to home during the hottest part of the day. They might lie down, rest, or sit quietly beside family members. The world outside would feel paused, as if everything was waiting for the heat to soften again. In these quiet hours, life felt slow and steady. Not empty. Just calm. And in this calm, children learned something important about their world. They learned patience without being told. They learned routine without needing explanation. They learned the shape of daily life simply by living inside it. As the sun slowly began to move downward later in the day, the village would begin to wake again. Soft activity returned. People moved again between homes and small workspaces. Water was carried. Food was prepared. Tools were used again. The air slowly changed, becoming easier to breathe as the heat lessened. Children would often become more active again during this time. They might play outside for a while. They might follow older siblings. They might sit near adults who were finishing daily work. Everything felt connected. Nothing felt separate. Life was not divided into strict sections like in modern times. Instead, it flowed like the river nearby, steady, continuous, always moving but never rushing. And as evening approached, the light would begin to soften again. Shadows would stretch across the ground. The sky would shift into warmer colors. The sound of the day would slowly fade. Inside the home, preparations for night would begin. Food might be cooked or shared. Small tasks would be completed. Water would be stored. Mats or sleeping places would be arranged again. Children would feel the tiredness of the day gently arriving. Not sharply. Not suddenly. But slowly, like the natural closing of a long breath. And in that quiet ending of the day, ancient Egypt would feel still again. Not silent in a lifeless way. But calm. Familiar. Peaceful. A place where time moved slowly enough for a child to grow, observe, and simply exist within the rhythm of the world around them. Morning in ancient Egypt arrived in a quiet and steady way. There was no sudden beginning to the day. No sharp break between night and morning. Instead, the light simply returned, slowly filling the rooms of small homes near the Nile. A child would often wake before or just as the sun began to rise. The air inside the home might feel slightly cool, especially during certain seasons. The walls, made of sun-dried mud brick, held the warmth of the previous day, but the night allowed them to soften again. A child waking up would usually not be alone. Family life was close. Simple. Shared within small spaces where everyone's presence was part of the same rhythm. Someone nearby might already be moving quietly, preparing for the day. The first moments after waking were calm. There was no hurry. A child might sit up slowly, adjusting to the soft light coming through an opening in the wall or doorway. Dust in the air could shimmer faintly in that early light, drifting without direction. Before anything else, there was washing. Water was important in daily life, even when it had to be carried from a well or stored carefully in jars. A child might use a small basin or container. The water would feel cool against the skin, refreshing after sleep. Faces were washed gently. Hands were cleaned. Sometimes feet were rinsed if the ground had been dusty from the day before. This simple act of washing was not rushed. It was part of beginning the day with clarity and readiness, even if life itself remained simple and predictable. After washing, clothing came next. In ancient Egypt, children usually wore light, simple garments suited to the warm climate. Linen was common. It felt soft and breathable, especially under the rising sun. A child might be dressed by a parent or help dress themselves as they grew older. Clothing was practical more than decorative in everyday life, especially in ordinary households. There was no large wardrobe to choose from. No complexity in dressing. Just familiar pieces worn again and again, cleaned and reused, shaped by daily life rather than fashion. Once dressed, the household slowly shifted into full morning activity. Bread was often prepared early in the day or already stored from the previous night. The smell of grain and baked dough could linger in the air of many homes. A child might eat a simple morning meal. Bread. Maybe fruit. Sometimes a little milk if available. The meal was quiet. Not a moment of ceremony, but a natural part of beginning the day. After eating, children often became part of small household tasks. These tasks were not heavy or overwhelming. They were simple, gradual introductions to responsibility. A child might carry small containers of water, help sweep the floor with a basic brush, bring objects from one place to another, or sit nearby while older family members worked. Everything was learned slowly. Not through formal teaching alone, but through repetition and observation. One of the most important parts of a child's morning was watching adults. Watching how bread was shaped. Watching how tools were handled. Watching how materials were stored carefully to last through the heat of the day. This quiet learning shaped much of childhood. There were no classrooms in the modern sense for most children in ordinary homes. Instead, life itself became the lesson. Outside the home, the village or settlement was gradually coming alive. People moved along narrow paths between houses. Some carried baskets. Others carried tools or food. The sound of soft footsteps on dry earth mixed with distant voices, but never felt overwhelming. Children sometimes followed older siblings or stayed near adults as they moved through early tasks. The world felt safe in its familiarity. Everything had its place. Everything had its time. As the sun rose higher, the brightness outside became stronger. The light reflected off sand, stone, and water, creating a steady glow across the land. During these hours, many children stayed close to shaded areas. Shade was important. It brought relief from the heat and made daily life easier to manage. Under trees, beside walls, or inside homes, people adjusted their activities to match the sun's movement. Inside these shaded spaces, children often continued learning in quiet ways. They might watch someone repair a tool. They might see grain being measured or stored. They might observe the careful preparation of food or household items. Nothing was rushed. Even work moved at a steady, controlled pace. The morning slowly stretched toward midday, and with it came a natural slowing of activity. This was a time for rest in many homes. Children might lie down on mats again, not necessarily to sleep deeply, but to remain still and quiet. The world outside became softer, as if the heat itself encouraged calmness. The sound of the village changed during this time. It became quieter, more distant. Even movement felt reduced, as though everything was conserving energy for later in the day. In this stillness, childhood in ancient Egypt continued gently. There was no pressure to fill every moment with activity. Instead, there was space. Space to rest. Space to observe. Space to simply exist within the rhythm of the day. And as time passed, the sun would continue its slow journey across the sky, marking the middle of the day without urgency or force. Life in these hours was not about doing more. It was about moving with the natural pace of the world. A pace that children grew into without even realizing it. And in this steady flow, the morning of ancient Egypt quietly became the long, warm middle of the day. As the sun climbed higher over ancient Egypt, the world began to change in a very gentle way. It was not a sudden change, but a slow settling. A soft shift in the air, in the sound, and in the movement of people. Midday was the warmest part of the day. The light became stronger, spreading across the land with a steady brightness. Sand, stone, and water all reflected the sun in their own quiet ways. The Nile shimmered in the distance, calm and slow, as it always was. Inside the homes, the walls of mud brick held the heat in a steady embrace. But even so, life adjusted naturally. Children, like the rest of the household, followed this rhythm without resistance. By this time of day, most morning tasks had already been completed. Water had been carried. Food had been eaten. Small chores had been done. Now came a different kind of time. A slower time. A resting time. Inside the home, the air would feel still. Not empty, but settled. A child might lie down on a woven mat or a simple sleeping surface. There was no strict rule forcing rest, but the heat itself encouraged it. The body naturally softened in response to the warmth. Some children might fall into light sleep. Others would simply remain still, listening to the quiet of the house. The sounds around them were faint. A distant movement outside. A soft shift of fabric. The quiet presence of family nearby. Even the village outside seemed to slow down during these hours. Paths that were busy in the morning now became calm. Doors stayed closed more often. Shade became the most important part of any space. People understood the rhythm of the day deeply. It was not written in rules for most families. It was simply lived. Children grew into this understanding early in life. They learned that midday was not a time for strong activity. It was a time for stillness, for cooling, for waiting as the sun reached its highest point. In some homes, adults might continue small tasks, but even those were done carefully and without rush. Repairing a tool. Preparing something for later. Checking stored food or materials. Everything moved at a reduced pace. Outside, the land itself seemed to pause. Fields near the Nile stood under the strong sun, but even farming activity often slowed during the hottest hours. Animals rested in shade. Birds became quieter. The world felt held in a steady moment of heat and light. For a child, this time of day carried a very specific feeling. It was not boredom. It was calmness. A kind of suspended quiet where nothing demanded attention. Inside that quiet, imagination could drift gently. A child might watch the soft movement of light on a wall. Or listen to the faint sound of wind passing outside. Or simply close their eyes and feel the warmth of the day soften their thoughts. Time in ancient Egypt did not feel broken into sharp segments. It flowed. Morning became midday. Midday became rest. Rest would slowly become afternoon. And children moved with it naturally. There was no urgency pushing them forward. Only the sun, the heat, and the quiet understanding of daily rhythm. As the afternoon slowly began to approach, the light outside started to shift again. The harshness of midday softened slightly. Shadows grew longer. The air, while still warm, became a little easier to breathe. This change was subtle. Almost unnoticeable at first. But it signaled the gentle return of activity. Inside homes, people began to stir again. Not suddenly, but gradually. A child might sit up from resting, rubbing their eyes slowly, adjusting once more to the world around them. The household would begin to move again in small ways. Water might be fetched. Food might be prepared for later. Tools or objects might be brought out for use. The rhythm of life returned, but still without rush. Children often rejoined activity during this time in simple ways. They might follow an older sibling outside. Or sit near adults as work resumed. Or continue playing quietly in shaded areas. Play in ancient Egypt was often simple and natural. Stones, small carved figures, pieces of wood, or handmade objects could become toys. Children did not need complex materials. Their imagination filled the space easily. The afternoon world had its own feeling. Different from morning. Different from midday rest. It felt more open. More active, but still calm. The river continued its steady presence nearby, shaping everything. Life along its banks always returned to it in one way or another. Water, fields, and movement of people all depended on its quiet strength. Children grew up seeing this connection every day. Not as a lesson, but as reality. As the afternoon moved forward, light grew softer again. The sun began its slow descent, and the world prepared for the final part of the day. The strongest heat faded. The land became gentler. And life, once again, found its evening rhythm. A rhythm that was calm, familiar, and deeply woven into the everyday life of ancient Egypt. As the heat of the day slowly began to fade, ancient Egypt changed its feeling once again. The light softened across the land. Shadows grew longer, stretching gently over sand and stone. The Nile reflected the sky in quieter tones, no longer the bright shimmer of midday, but a calmer surface of moving light. For children, this part of the day often felt more open, more free. After the stillness of midday rest, the return of afternoon activity carried a lightness with it. The body felt easier. The air felt less heavy. And movement outside became more comfortable again. Children would slowly step back into the world of sound and motion. Not in a rush, but in a natural unfolding. One of the most familiar parts of childhood in ancient Egypt was play. Play was simple. Not built around structured rules or complex tools. Instead, it came from everyday objects, shaped by imagination and time. A small carved figure might become a companion in a game. A smooth stone could represent something meaningful in a child's mind. Pieces of wood or clay might be shaped into forms that felt alive in their hands. Even without elaborate toys, children found ways to create their own small worlds. Some toys did exist in more crafted forms. Small dolls made from wood or clay. Tiny animal figures. Simple objects that could be moved or placed in pretend scenes. But even these were not separate from daily life. They reflected it. Children often learned through imitation. They would watch adults carefully during the day. The way hands shaped dough. The way containers were carried. The way tools were used with steady care. Then, in play, they would recreate these actions in their own quiet way. A child might pretend to prepare food using small objects. Or mimic the movement of workers seen earlier in the day. Or build small arrangements in the sand near their home. This was learning without instruction. Understanding without formal teaching. The world itself became the classroom. As the afternoon deepened, children often gathered in small groups when possible. Siblings. Neighbors. Other children from nearby homes. They would play in shaded areas where the sun was softer and the ground was cooler. Laughter was not loud or constant. It came and went gently, blending into the background of daily life. Sometimes children played alone as well. Solitary play was not seen as strange. It was simply part of the rhythm of growing up. A child might sit quietly, arranging objects in a pattern. Or observe insects moving slowly across the ground. Or trace shapes in the dust with a finger. Even these small moments carried a sense of peace. There was no pressure to fill every moment. Time was experienced differently. It stretched. It settled. It moved like water rather than like something that needed to be controlled. Meanwhile, adults continued their own work in the background of the village. Simple tasks resumed after rest hours. Repairing, preparing, organizing. Nothing rushed. Everything steady. Children often watched this quietly. Watching remained one of the most important ways of learning. A child might sit near a parent weaving or working with materials. Or observe someone shaping clay or grinding grain. Or simply listen to the sounds of tools being used in a careful rhythm. These observations stayed with them. Not as formal lessons, but as memory shaped by repetition. As the afternoon moved toward evening, the temperature continued to soften. The harsh brightness of the sun disappeared gradually. The sky began to shift in color. Warm tones appeared across the horizon, slowly deepening as the day moved forward. This was one of the most peaceful times in ancient Egypt. Work did not feel heavy now. Movement did not feel difficult. Everything seemed to settle into a balanced flow. Children often felt this change deeply, even if they could not describe it. The world simply felt easier. More open. More breathable. Some children helped with small evening tasks. Collecting items. Bringing water. Assisting with simple household preparations. These tasks were not strict duties. They were part of life. Part of belonging to the rhythm of the home. Evening meals were often prepared or gathered during this time. Bread, grains, simple vegetables or fruits depending on availability. Food was shared quietly, often within the home or just outside it as the air cooled. Families gathered together more closely as daylight faded. The day was nearing its end, but there was no sense of urgency. Only completion. Only return. Children, tired from a full day of waking, resting, and playing, often became quieter again. Their energy softened as the sky darkened. And in that gentle transition, ancient Egypt prepared itself for night. A night that would arrive not with force, but with calm inevitability, like a curtain slowly drawn across the sky. As the sun lowered further, ancient Egypt began to change in a way that felt almost like a slow breath exhaling. The light softened across the land, no longer strong or sharp. Instead, it turned warm and gentle, spreading in long shapes over the sand and water. The Nile River, always present, reflected the evening sky with a calm surface. It moved slowly, as if it too was resting after the long heat of the day. For children, this was a familiar and comforting time. Evening was not rushed. It did not demand urgency. It arrived gently, bringing with it a sense of completion. Inside homes, families began to gather more closely. Doors that had been open during the day might remain open still, but the feeling inside was different now. The heat of midday was gone. The air was easier. The world felt softer. Children returned from small play areas or quiet wandering near their homes. They came back slowly, without being called loudly or urgently. It was simply understood that evening meant return. Return to home. Return to family. Return to stillness. Inside the home, light became dimmer as the sun moved lower. Sometimes small oil lamps or simple sources of light might be prepared, but often the fading daylight itself was enough. Shadows filled the corners of rooms. Walls that had felt bright earlier now held a softer tone. The sound of the household changed too. During the day, there had been movement, footsteps, tasks, small activities. Now there was a quieter rhythm. A slower presence. A sense that everything was settling into place for the night ahead. Children often took part in very small evening responsibilities. These were not heavy duties. They were simple actions that helped the household prepare for night. Bringing water jars inside. Helping arrange sleeping mats. Collecting small objects that had been used during the day. Assisting in cleaning or organizing shared space. Each task was small on its own. But together, they formed part of daily life. Part of belonging. In many homes, evening meals were shared during this time. Simple food. Bread that had been prepared earlier or stored carefully. Grains or vegetables depending on what was available. Occasionally fruit or honey if it was present. The act of eating was quiet. Families often sat together in close space. There was conversation sometimes, but not in a rushed or loud way. More often, it was calm. Soft exchanges. The kind of speaking that blends easily with the fading light. Children sat near their families, feeling the warmth of shared presence. The day had been long, but not exhausting in a harsh way. It had followed a natural rhythm from morning to evening. And now that rhythm was approaching its final stage. After eating, there was often a period of stillness. People remained together for a while. Not doing much. Just being. Children might sit quietly, leaning near a parent or sibling. Some might feel drowsy. Others might simply observe the slow movement of evening life around them. Outside, the village also began to quiet further. The paths between homes became less active. Work for the day had ended for most people. The sounds of movement faded gradually. Even animals seemed to settle. The world did not become silent, but it became gentler. More contained. More inward. The sky continued its slow transformation. The bright tones of afternoon gave way to deeper colors. Soft oranges, then muted reds, then the beginning of blue and darkness. Stars would soon begin to appear, but at this moment, they were still faint. Not yet fully visible. Just waiting behind the fading light. Children often noticed this change without speaking about it. The sky taught them time in a quiet way. Not through words, but through presence. As darkness approached, homes prepared for night. Sleeping areas were arranged again. Simple mats laid out on the ground. Soft coverings adjusted. Belongings placed neatly aside. Everything was set in order, not out of strict requirement, but out of habit shaped by daily repetition. Children became quieter during this time. Their energy from the day faded naturally. Some might already feel sleep coming before night fully arrived. Others stayed awake a little longer, simply listening to the sounds of the household settling. There was something peaceful in this transition. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just slow ending. The kind of ending that feels natural to the body and mind. Outside, the last light of day touched the horizon. Then slowly, it began to disappear. Night was arriving. And with it came a deeper stillness, one that wrapped the world in quiet darkness, while families in ancient Egypt rested together under the long, calm sky. When night finally arrived in ancient Egypt, it did not arrive suddenly. It came slowly, like a soft curtain being drawn across the sky, one gentle layer at a time. The last light of the sun faded behind the horizon, leaving behind a deepening blue that slowly turned darker with each passing moment. The Nile River, which had reflected the sky all day, now became a quieter presence. It was still there, still moving, but it looked different in the dark. Less visible. More felt than seen. Inside the homes, life also began to slow completely. Children were among the first to feel it fully. The long day, shaped by waking, resting, playing, and observing, now reached its final stage. There was no struggle against this ending. No resistance. Only acceptance. A natural closing of the day, like the body itself remembering it was time to rest. Inside the mud brick homes, the air felt cooler now. The heat of midday had long gone, and even the warmth of afternoon had softened. Night brought a different feeling, still, quiet, and steady. Families gathered one last time before sleep. Sometimes there was soft conversation. Sometimes only silence. The voices that did speak were low and gentle, blending into the darkness rather than breaking it. Children stayed close to their families during these final hours. In many homes, sleeping arrangements were simple and shared. Mats laid out on the floor. Soft coverings adjusted for comfort. People resting close together, both for warmth and familiarity. There was comfort in closeness. Not isolation. Not separation. But shared space. Shared rest. As children lay down, their bodies slowly relaxed. The day's movement settled into stillness. Their breathing became slower. Their thoughts less active. The world around them faded gently from attention. Outside, the village became almost entirely quiet. The sounds of daytime life, walking, working, carrying, preparing, had all disappeared. Now there was only the faint presence of night. Occasional movement of wind across the land. A distant sound that might come and go without direction. The subtle presence of life continuing in quiet forms. The stars above ancient Egypt began to appear more clearly. One by one, they revealed themselves in the deepening sky. They were not bright in a harsh way. They were steady. Constant. Unmoving from the perspective of those below. Children might have seen them through small openings or gaps in the home's structure, or as they lay near entrances where the night air could be felt. The sky at night was vast. It made the world feel both larger and smaller at the same time. Larger because of its endlessness. Smaller because everything below it seemed gently contained within it. In this stillness, sleep came naturally. Not forced. Not delayed. But arriving like part of the same rhythm that guided the entire day. A child in ancient Egypt did not think of sleep as something separate from life. It was simply the next stage of it. Just as morning followed night, and evening followed afternoon, sleep followed waking. Inside the homes, bodies became still. One by one, people settled fully into rest. The sounds of breathing filled the quiet spaces. Soft. Even. Steady. The world outside remained calm. The Nile continued its slow movement. The desert around it stayed silent and wide. The wind moved gently across open spaces, not strong enough to disturb, only present enough to be noticed if one were awake to hear it. But most were not awake. They were sleeping. Children dreamed in quiet ways, shaped not by noise or intensity, but by the simple impressions of their day. Water. Light. Movement. Family. Play. Rest. These impressions did not feel separate in sleep. They blended together, forming a soft continuation of life rather than an escape from it. Night in ancient Egypt was long, but not frightening. It was natural. Familiar. Part of the same cycle that governed everything. The sky above remained steady, filled with stars that had watched over the land for countless generations. Below them, life rested. Not paused permanently. Not ended. Only resting. Waiting for morning to return again, as it always did. And in that deep quiet, ancient Egypt became still enough to feel almost timeless, as if the entire world had gently slowed its breath until the next sunrise would begin it once more. Night in ancient Egypt never truly felt like an ending. It felt more like a pause. A long, gentle pause where the world rested quietly under the wide sky, and everything waited for the return of light. As the hours passed in darkness, the land remained still. Homes were quiet. Villages were still. The Nile moved slowly, almost silently, reflecting nothing now except the memory of the sky above it. Children slept deeply during this time. Their bodies relaxed into the warmth of shared space inside their homes. The ground beneath them was firm but familiar. The air around them was calm, slightly cooler than the day before, holding the softness of night. There were no sharp interruptions. No sudden changes. Only rest. Only stillness. And then, without urgency, the night began to shift again. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. But in a way so subtle that it could almost go unnoticed. The darkness slowly softened. The deep black of the sky began to loosen into a darker shade of blue. The stars, which had seemed so steady and bright, began to fade gently as if stepping backward into distance. Far on the horizon, where land met sky, the first hint of light appeared. It was not strong. It was not bright. It was only a suggestion of change. A quiet promise that the world would begin again. Inside the homes, children and adults still slept. But sleep itself began to shift in quality. Bodies started to become slightly more aware of space and sound, even if still resting deeply. This was the earliest stage of morning. A time when the world was not yet awake, but no longer fully asleep. The first true sounds of the new day were small. A faint movement inside a home. A soft shift of fabric. A quiet breath becoming deeper or more regular. Nothing sudden. Nothing loud. Just the natural return of life. As the sky continued to brighten, the first light of dawn began to spread slowly across the land. It moved gradually, touching the tops of distant fields first, then the edges of homes, then the open spaces near the river. The Nile itself began to reflect this change again. Its surface, once dark and still, started to hold a faint glow of early light. Inside the homes, children began to wake. Not all at once. Not in a rush. But in a natural, unforced rhythm. One child might open their eyes and remain still for a moment, adjusting to the change in light. Another might sit up quietly, looking around the familiar space of home. The feeling of morning was always gentle. It did not arrive like an interruption. It arrived like continuation. As if night had simply turned itself inside out and become day again. The air inside the home felt slightly different now. Cooler than midday would become later. Fresh in a quiet way. Carrying the faint scent of the earth outside, where dew or coolness might still rest on surfaces. Families began to stir. Slowly. Naturally. There was no rush in these early moments. Morning in ancient Egypt had its own calm pace. A child might first sit and simply exist in the space between sleep and waking. Listening to the quiet sounds of the home coming alive again. A parent or older family member might already be moving softly, preparing for the day ahead. Water would soon be needed again. Water was always a part of beginning. It might be carried from a storage jar kept inside the home or brought from a nearby source depending on the household's situation. The act of water gathering was simple but meaningful. It marked the transition from rest to activity. A child might watch or help in small ways. Holding a container. Standing nearby. Observing the careful handling of something so essential. Even at this early hour, life already had structure. But it was not strict. It was natural. Like breathing. Outside, the village slowly awakened. Paths between homes began to show movement again. A few people at first. Then more. Not crowded. Not noisy. Just steady. Like the slow unfolding of a shared routine. The fields near the Nile began to show signs of life as well. Farmers and workers would eventually move toward their tasks, but even that movement began gently, without sudden urgency. Children watched this world reappear each morning. It was familiar to them. So familiar that it felt like part of the natural order of things. Night fades. Morning returns. Life begins again. Inside homes, simple morning preparations would begin once more. Bread might be taken out. Small food prepared. Tools or household items arranged for use. Children would again find themselves part of this rhythm. Not as separate observers, but as participants in daily life. A child might carry something small across a room. Or sit nearby while food was prepared. Or simply watch the careful movements of family members beginning their day. Everything was slow. Everything was steady. The day had returned, not with force, but with quiet continuity. And as the light outside grew stronger, ancient Egypt once again stepped fully into morning, continuing the endless cycle that shaped every child's life along the Nile. As morning fully settled over ancient Egypt, the light grew stronger across the land. It did not arrive in a sudden burst. It expanded slowly, like a warm breath spreading over sand, water, and stone. The Nile River, always present at the center of life, began to shine more clearly again. Its surface caught the sunlight in soft reflections that moved gently with the current. Villages near the river became more active as the morning deepened. Not in a hurried way, but in a steady unfolding. Children were already awake by now. Some had been awake since dawn. Others had just risen as the household became more active. Morning in ancient Egypt carried a familiar rhythm that children grew into naturally. There was no need for reminders or urgency. The day itself guided movement. Inside homes, simple morning routines continued. Water was used again for washing. Faces, hands, and feet were cleaned in quiet repetition of the same actions from the previous day. Clothing was adjusted or straightened. Small meals were prepared or shared. Bread remained a constant part of life. Simple. Reliable. Familiar. Children often ate alongside their families in calm, close spaces. The morning meal was not a ceremony. It was simply part of beginning. After eating, the day's activity slowly resumed. For children, this meant a gradual return to observation, play, and small responsibilities. Life was not divided sharply into work and rest in the way modern life often is. Instead, everything flowed together. A child might begin the morning by helping in a small way. Carrying something light. Bringing an object from one place to another. Or sitting nearby while adults prepared tools or materials for the day. Even these small actions were part of learning. Not formal learning, but lived learning. Much of a child's understanding of the world came from watching. Watching how hands worked carefully. Watching how materials were handled with attention. Watching how tasks were repeated every day with quiet skill. Near many homes, small courtyards or open spaces became places of morning activity. Children might play there briefly, using simple objects or natural materials. Stones arranged in patterns. Clay shaped into rough forms. Small carved items or handmade figures used in imagination. Play and observation were closely connected. A child might imitate what they had seen the day before. The movements of adults. The rhythm of household tasks. The structure of daily work. This imitation was not exact. It was gentle. A way of understanding the world by recreating it in small, safe forms. Outside the home, the wider village continued its steady awakening. People moved between homes, storage spaces, and work areas. Some carried baskets. Some carried tools. Some walked toward fields near the Nile. The river was the center of much activity. Fields along its edges were carefully tended. Not rushed. Not chaotic. But maintained with steady attention over time. Children often saw these fields from a distance or while accompanying adults. The sight of them became familiar early in life. Rows of green near the water. Earth-shaped and prepared for planting or growth. Workers moving slowly between sections of land. Everything followed the rhythm of the river. The Nile's movement was slow and constant. It shaped the land gently over time. It brought water, soil, and life in ways that supported everything around it. Children grew up understanding this connection without needing it explained. The river meant life. And life meant rhythm. As morning moved toward midday, the light became stronger again. Shadows shortened. Heat began to build slowly in the air. But for now, in these earlier hours, movement was still comfortable. Work continued in a steady way. Tasks were done step by step. Nothing rushed. Even in labor, there was a sense of calm repetition. Children sometimes followed older family members to nearby work areas. Not to perform heavy tasks, but to observe. To be present. To learn through proximity. They might sit in shaded areas while adults worked nearby. Watching silently. Listening to sounds of tools, water, and movement. The world of ancient Egypt was deeply sensory in this way. Not overwhelming, but consistent. Sounds repeated in familiar patterns. Movements followed established rhythms. Days followed the same gentle structure. For a child, this created a sense of stability. Predictability. Comfort in repetition. As the morning continued, the village gradually settled into its full daytime rhythm. Some people worked steadily. Some remained near homes. Some tended to animals or stored goods. Some prepared materials for later use. Everything moved together like a slow, coordinated flow. Children remained part of this world. Not separate from it. Not outside of it. But woven into it. Their day was not divided sharply into instruction and leisure. It was one continuous experience of observing, participating, resting, and playing. And as the sun climbed higher again, the morning began its quiet transition toward the heat of midday. A transition that, like everything in ancient Egypt, happened slowly and naturally, without interruption, carrying the day forward in its endless, gentle cycle along the Nile. As the morning moved forward, the sun continued its steady rise over ancient Egypt, reaching higher into the sky with unchanging patience. The light grew stronger across the fields, homes, and paths that stretched along the Nile. What had begun as a soft morning glow now became a full brightness that covered everything evenly, as if the entire land was gently held beneath the sun's presence. For children, the change was familiar. They had already lived through it many times before, even in their short lives. Morning always became warmer. Activity always slowed. And the world always seemed to lean into stillness as the heat deepened. Inside homes, life adjusted without needing instruction. Doors might remain open to allow air to move through the rooms, but the feeling inside changed as the temperature rose. The mud brick walls, which had once felt cool in the early morning, now began to hold warmth. The air became heavier, slower, more settled. Children noticed this shift in their own way. Not through thought, but through sensation. The way movement felt slightly more tiring. The way sitting still became more comfortable than walking. The way the world outside seemed brighter, almost too bright to stay in for long periods. By this time, morning tasks were usually completed. The household had already gone through its early rhythm, waking, washing, eating, light activity. Now came the familiar pause that always followed. Midday rest. It was not announced. It was not forced. It was simply understood as part of life. Inside homes, children would gradually settle down again. Some might lie on mats placed in shaded areas of the house. Others might sit quietly near family members who were also resting or doing very light tasks. Some might drift into sleep without realizing it. The heat itself encouraged stillness. Not discomfort in a harsh sense, but a natural slowing of energy. Outside, the village also softened in activity. Paths between homes became less active. Movement decreased. Sounds grew fewer. Even the fields near the Nile appeared quieter, as workers and animals adjusted to the strongest part of the day passing overhead. The river, however, continued unchanged. Always moving. Always steady. It did not rush in heat or slow in rest. It simply flowed, as it always had. For children, midday carried a very specific feeling. It was not empty. It was not boring. It was calm. A deep kind of calm that shaped memory without needing words. Inside that calm, time felt different. It stretched gently. Moments seemed longer, softer, less divided. A child resting during this time might experience the world in fragments. Light filtering through a wall opening. A faint sound from outside that comes and goes. The feeling of warm air settling around still bodies. The rhythm of breathing in shared space. Everything was close. Everything was quiet. In many homes, this was a time of minimal activity. Adults might remain awake but still. Children might sleep or rest. Even the simplest tasks were delayed until later hours when the heat began to ease. The sun, at its highest point, marked a kind of stillness over the entire land. Not a stop, but a pause. A shared understanding between nature and daily life. As midday continued, the brightness outside remained strong, but the feeling of the day did not change much. It held steady. Like a long, warm moment suspended in time. Children often drifted in and out of light sleep during these hours. Their dreams, if they came, were shaped by ordinary impressions. Water. Light. Home. Movement from earlier in the day. Nothing intense. Nothing dramatic. Just simple reflections of life as it was lived. Outside, even the wind seemed less active during these hours. It moved gently, passing over fields and open spaces without force. The land felt wide and quiet under the sun's presence. And then, very slowly, the highest point of the day began to pass. Not visibly at first, but gradually. Subtly. The light stopped rising and began to settle into a steady level. This marked the beginning of change. Not yet afternoon, but the soft turning point where the heat would eventually begin to ease. Inside homes, children might begin to stir again. Not fully awake at first, just returning slowly to awareness. Stretching, sitting up, adjusting to the room around them. The household would also begin to shift slightly. Not yet into full activity, but into readiness. Readiness for the second half of the day. Water might be checked again. Simple tasks might be prepared. People might begin to sit up from rest. Everything still calm. Still slow, but gently moving forward again. Midday in ancient Egypt was not an interruption to life. It was part of it. A necessary pause that allowed the day to continue in balance. And as the heat began its very slow transition toward afternoon, the world remained wrapped in a quiet stillness, waiting for the softer return of movement that always came after the sun's strongest moment had passed. As the sun slowly moved past its highest point, ancient Egypt began to change again in a quiet and almost unnoticeable way. The midday stillness did not break suddenly. It softened. The heat was still present, but it no longer felt like it was rising. Instead, it began to settle into a steady warmth that held the land in a calmer balance. For children, this shift was familiar. It was the moment when rest no longer felt like the only natural choice. The body, which had grown still during the midday pause, slowly began to wake again. Not all at once, but in small stages. Inside the homes, light shifted slightly as the sun moved across the sky. Shadows that had been short and still began to stretch again. The air inside rooms felt a little more open, a little less heavy. Children were often the first to stir. A slow movement. A change in breathing. Eyes opening after rest or light sleep. The afternoon in ancient Egypt did not begin with urgency. It began with awareness returning gently. A child might sit up from a resting place and simply remain still for a moment, adjusting again to the world around them. The sounds of the household also began to return. Soft movement from nearby. A quiet shift of objects. The faint sound of people beginning small tasks again. Everything remained calm, but life was no longer paused. It was resuming. Outside, the village followed the same pattern. The paths between homes became slowly active again. Not crowded. Not loud. Just gradual movement returning after the heat of midday had passed its strongest point. In many homes, this was the time when small tasks were resumed. Nothing heavy. Nothing rushed. Simple actions that fit into the gentle flow of the day. Children often participated in these tasks in their own small ways. They might carry something light from one place to another, help organize objects used earlier in the day, or bring water for household use. These were not burdens. They were part of belonging, part of growing into the rhythm of life. At the same time, children also returned to play. Afternoon play was different from morning play. It often felt looser, less structured, more spread out in time and space. A child might sit in a shaded area near the home, arranging small objects in the sand or dust. Another might follow a sibling quietly, watching whatever activity was happening nearby. Some might simply walk slowly around familiar spaces, observing the world as it moved again. Play and observation remained closely connected. Even when not formally working or helping, children were always learning. Through sight. Through repetition. Through presence. The river continued its constant influence on everything. Its steady flow remained unchanged throughout the day. Even as the land warmed and cooled in cycles, the Nile stayed consistent, shaping fields and supporting life along its edges. Children who lived near it grew up with this constant presence. It became part of their understanding of the world without needing explanation. As afternoon continued, the light slowly began to soften again. Not yet evening. But no longer the strong brightness of earlier hours. The sky held a warmer tone, and shadows became longer as the sun gradually lowered. Work across the village followed this change. Tasks that had been paused or slowed during midday were now completed or continued at a comfortable pace. Everything remained steady. Nothing forced. Even movement itself seemed to follow the rhythm of the sun. Inside homes, the atmosphere became more active but still calm. People moved between spaces. Objects were used and returned. Simple preparations for later in the day were made. Children remained part of this flow. Not separate from it. Not outside of it. But moving through it naturally. A child might watch someone preparing food for the evening. Or sit nearby as tools were cleaned or stored. Or quietly help with small household routines. Each action was simple on its own. But together, they formed the structure of daily life. As the afternoon deepened, the feeling of the day became more balanced. The harshness of midday was gone. The stillness of rest had passed. What remained was a calm, steady movement toward evening. Children often felt this transition clearly, even if they could not describe it. There was a sense of openness returning. A sense that the day was once again available for movement, play, and shared time. Outside, the light continued to shift. The sun moved lower. The air became slightly easier to breathe. And the long shadows of afternoon began to stretch across the land, marking the slow approach of evening once again. Life in ancient Egypt continued forward in this gentle cycle. Always moving. Always returning. Never rushed. Never broken. Just flowing, like the river that shaped everything along its banks. As the afternoon continued to fade, ancient Egypt entered a quieter and more balanced part of the day. The sun was no longer high and intense. It had begun its slow descent, lowering itself across the wide sky with steady patience. The light across the land softened again, turning from bright midday tones into warmer shades that felt easier on the eyes. Shadows stretched longer now, moving across sand, water, and the walls of homes like slow, gentle lines marking the passing hours. For children, this time of day carried a familiar sense of return. Return to family presence. Return to softer activity. Return to the comfort of evening rhythm slowly approaching. Inside homes, the air felt more comfortable than it had at midday. The heat was still present, but it no longer pressed heavily on everything. Movement became easier again. Breathing felt lighter. The world seemed to open itself once more after the stillness of midday and the gradual activity of afternoon. Families began to gather more closely as the day moved toward its final hours. Not in a formal way, but naturally. People moved back toward shared spaces. Children returned from small play areas or quiet wandering near the home. Their steps were slower now, shaped by the long rhythm of the day. Inside the home, small evening tasks began again. These were not difficult or demanding tasks. They were part of preparation for night. Water might be checked and stored. Simple items used during the day were gathered. Sleeping spaces were prepared in advance so that night would arrive without effort. Children often helped in these tasks. Not because they were required in a strict sense, but because participation was part of life. Part of belonging to the household. At the same time, the feeling of the home itself began to change. The light inside became softer. The contrast between inside and outside lessened. Rooms that had been bright earlier in the day now held a gentle warmth of fading sunlight. Outside, the village also shifted. Work was gradually being completed for the day. People returned from fields or work areas. Paths that had been active earlier became quieter again. The rhythm of movement slowed as evening approached. The Nile continued its steady presence in the background of everything. It reflected the changing sky once more, holding the colors of late afternoon and early evening in its calm surface. Children often noticed this without needing to speak about it. The river was always there. Always changing with the light. Always steady in its movement. As the sun lowered further, the air began to cool slightly. Not sharply, but gently. This cooling marked one of the most comfortable transitions of the day. It signaled the nearing end of work and the beginning of rest. Inside homes, families often gathered more closely during this time. Some might sit together quietly. Others might continue small tasks while remaining in shared space. Conversation, when it happened, was soft. Unhurried. Even silence felt natural here. Children sat near their families, feeling the closeness of the evening environment. The long day behind them was not something to separate from. It was something to settle into. A complete cycle that had moved from morning to midday, from rest to afternoon activity, and now into evening calm. As light continued to fade, food for the evening might be prepared or shared. Simple meals. Familiar meals. Bread, grains, and whatever small items were available in the household. Eating during this time was not rushed. It was part of closing the day together. A shared moment of completion. Outside, the sky slowly transformed again. Warm tones began to deepen. Orange softened into red, then into muted shades of dusk. The horizon held the last strong light of the sun before it disappeared beyond the edge of the land. Children often felt a quiet shift in themselves during this time. Energy from the day softened. Movement slowed. Thoughts became less active. The body prepared naturally for rest. Not through instruction, but through rhythm. Through repetition of daily life. As evening deepened further, homes began final preparations for night. Sleeping spaces were arranged. Simple mats were placed. Clothing adjusted. Belongings settled into their familiar places. Everything moved toward stillness. Not abruptly, but gently. Like a world slowly lowering itself into quiet. Children remained close to their families during these final hours of daylight. The presence of others felt comforting as the outside world dimmed. And as the last light of the sun finally faded from the sky, ancient Egypt once again stepped into night, quiet, steady, and familiar, ready to repeat the gentle cycle that shaped every single day along the Nile. When night returned again to ancient Egypt, it did not feel like something new. It felt like something remembered. The darkness arrived slowly, spreading across the land with a softness that replaced the last traces of sunlight. The sky deepened into quiet layers of dark blue and then into the stillness of full night. Stars began to appear once more. One by one. Not in a sudden burst, but in a patient unfolding across the wide sky. They looked distant and calm, as if they had always been there and always would remain. The Nile River, still moving through the land, reflected the faint light of the stars in gentle fragments. Its surface was calm, carrying the night without resistance. Inside the homes, life had already begun to settle. The final moments of evening had passed, and now the household entered its most quiet stage. Night sleep. Children lay down in familiar spaces. Mats arranged carefully. Simple coverings adjusted. Bodies resting close to family members or within shared rooms. There was comfort in this closeness. Not just physical warmth, but emotional familiarity. The feeling of being together as the world outside became dark and still. Voices faded completely now. Conversation ended. Even small movements slowed until they stopped. The home became quiet in a deep and natural way. Not empty, but complete. Children drifted into sleep at their own pace. Some fell asleep quickly, their bodies already softened by the long rhythm of the day. Others remained half aware for a little longer, listening to the faint sounds of night outside. A distant wind passing over land. The subtle shifting of air through open spaces. The soft presence of the world continuing beyond the walls. Sleep in ancient Egypt was not a separation from life. It was part of it. A continuation in a different form. Dreams, when they came, were shaped by ordinary impressions of daily living. The river, the sun, the feeling of walking, the memory of play, the presence of family, the rhythm of work and rest. These elements blended together in sleep without sharp edges. Just as the day itself had no sharp edges. Everything flowed. Inside the home, the stillness grew deeper as the night continued. Bodies remained motionless. Breathing became slow and steady. The shared space of the household felt unified in rest. Outside, the village was silent. Paths between homes were empty. Work had ended long ago. Even animals had settled into their own quiet routines. The land itself seemed to rest beneath the sky. And yet, nothing was truly still. The Nile continued its journey. Slow. Constant. Uninterrupted. It moved through darkness just as it moved through daylight. A reminder that life did not stop when people slept. It only changed its form. The night hours passed gently. Without interruption. Without urgency. Time moved forward in a way that felt almost unnoticeable. And as it always did, the darkness gradually began to soften again. Far on the horizon, a faint change began to appear. A subtle shift in tone. A quiet suggestion that night would not remain forever. Dawn was returning. Not yet fully visible. Not yet fully present. But already beginning. Inside homes, children and families continued to sleep, unaware of the exact moment when the world outside would begin to change again. The cycle was always the same. Night to morning. Rest to waking. Silence to movement. Stillness to life. Ancient Egypt did not feel like a place of separate days. It felt like one continuous breath. One endless rhythm along the Nile. And as the first faint hint of morning light prepared to return, the world remained quiet for just a little longer, holding its peaceful stillness before the next gentle beginning. The night in ancient Egypt never ended with a sharp moment. It softened away. Slowly. Almost without being noticed. Long before most people woke, the sky had already begun to change in the quietest way. The deep darkness above the land loosened first at the edges, where the horizon met the earth. A faint shift appeared there, so subtle it could almost be missed. It was not brightness yet. Only a thinning of darkness. A gentle sign that the world was preparing to turn again. Inside the homes, children and families were still asleep. Their bodies rested in shared warmth, surrounded by the familiar stillness of night. The air inside remained cool and calm, holding the last quiet moments before morning returned. Breathing was slow. Steady. Deep. Everything was at rest. Outside, the Nile continued its silent movement through the land. It reflected nothing now except the faint suggestion of change beginning in the sky. And then, little by little, the first true hint of dawn appeared. A soft line of light along the horizon. Not strong. Not bright. Just present. A quiet announcement that another day was beginning to form. As this light slowly grew, the darkness of night began to lose its depth. Stars faded gradually, one by one, not disappearing all at once, but stepping back into the growing brightness. The world remained silent. But it was no longer fully still in the same way. Morning was returning. Inside the homes, children began to shift. Not immediately waking, but moving within sleep. A change in breathing. A small adjustment in position. A gradual return of awareness. The body always knew this moment, even without understanding it. The world outside was changing, and the body responded before the mind fully did. Soon, eyes began to open. One child at a time. Slowly. Without rush. The feeling of waking in ancient Egypt was gentle. There was no sudden alarm or disruption. Only the natural return of light. Children might remain lying still for a moment after waking, looking toward the soft brightness entering through openings in the home. The light was not harsh yet. It was calm, almost tender in its early presence. Inside the household, adults also began to stir. Movement returned quietly. A shift of fabric. A careful step across the floor. The soft preparation of beginning again. Mourning in ancient Egypt did not begin with urgency. It began with awareness. A shared understanding that the cycle was continuing. Water would soon be used again. Faces and hands would be washed in the familiar rhythm of daily life. Simple food would be prepared or taken from storage. Clothing would be adjusted for the new day. Children moved through these actions as part of the household flow. Not separate. Not directed sharply. But included naturally. Outside, the village also began to reawaken. The first people appeared on paths between homes. Slow movements at first. Then gradually more. The sound of life returned softly to the land. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just steady. Like a quiet unfolding. The fields near the Nile began to show movement again as well. Work would resume later, but even early preparation for the day carried a calm rhythm. The river itself remained unchanged. Always flowing. Always present. Always shaping the life around it. Children often looked toward it during these early hours. It was familiar. Comforting. A constant part of the landscape of their lives. As the light strengthened slightly more, the world became clearer again. Shapes defined themselves. Spaces became visible. The outlines of homes, trees, and paths returned in soft detail. But the feeling of the morning was still gentle. Not yet fully awake. Still in transition. Inside homes, families prepared for the next cycle of the day. The same rhythm that had existed before would begin again. Waking. Washing. Eating. Moving. Resting. Playing. Observing. A pattern that repeated endlessly, yet never felt the same twice. Because each day carried its own quiet version of life. Its own small differences. Its own soft experiences for children growing up along the Nile. And as the sun prepared to rise fully once again, ancient Egypt stood at the edge of another morning, still calm, still steady, still flowing within the endless rhythm of days that never truly ended, only continued. As dawn deepened, the first true sunrise of the new day slowly unfolded over ancient Egypt. The light that had once been only a faint line along the horizon now expanded upward, spreading gently across the sky in soft layers of gold and pale orange. It did not rush. It did not strike. It simply arrived. Like something inevitable, returning again as it always had. The land beneath it responded in silence. Fields near the Nile began to glow softly. The river itself caught the rising light and reflected it in long, quiet streaks. Homes and paths slowly became more visible as the darkness fully loosened its hold. Inside the homes, children were now fully awake. Morning was no longer a suggestion. It was present. Clear. Familiar. The household moved into its daily rhythm again, as it had so many times before. Water was brought or taken from storage. The simple act of washing returned, as it always did at the beginning of the day. Faces, hands, and feet were cleaned in slow, repeated motion. There was comfort in this repetition. It marked the transition from night into waking life. Clothing was adjusted again for the growing warmth. Simple linen garments suited for the day ahead. Nothing complicated. Nothing excessive. Just what was needed for living under the sun. Food was prepared or shared in small portions. Bread remained central. Familiar. Reliable. Present in almost every morning. Children sat with their families during this time. Not formally. Not arranged in any strict way. Just together, sharing the beginning of another day. Outside, the village now felt fully awake. Movement along paths became more regular. People passed between homes and open spaces. The sounds of daily life returned gently. Footsteps on dry ground. Quiet exchanges between neighbors. The soft rhythm of a community beginning its work again. Children moved within this environment naturally. Some stayed close to home. Some followed older family members. Some drifted into small spaces where play or observation could take place. There was no separation between learning and living. Everything was connected. Everything was part of the same flow. As the sun rose higher, the light became stronger across the land. Morning was now fully established. The heat would come later, as it always did. But for now, the world remained balanced in early brightness. Fields near the Nile showed activity again. Preparation for work or continued tasks resumed in steady motion. The river continued its constant presence, unchanged by time of day. It shaped everything around it quietly, without interruption. Children often noticed this consistency without needing to think about it. The river was simply there. Like the sky. Like the sun. Like the rhythm of waking and sleeping. Inside homes, the structure of the day was already familiar. Morning would lead into midday rest. Rest would lead into afternoon movement. Afternoon would lead into evening gathering. Evening would lead back into night. And night would return again into morning. The cycle continued without end. Not as repetition in a dull sense, but as rhythm, as stability, as the natural shape of life itself. Children growing up in this world experienced time differently than in fast-moving environments. Time was not something that rushed forward. It unfolded. It repeated. It returned. Each day held small variations, but the structure remained the same. And within that structure, childhood unfolded quietly. Through observation. Through small tasks. Through play. Through rest. Through presence within the household and the wider village. As the morning fully matured, life across ancient Egypt settled into its familiar daytime rhythm once again. Nothing felt final. Nothing felt interrupted. Everything continued. And as the sun moved steadily across the sky, the cycle of the day so deeply woven into the lives of children along the Nile carried on in its endless, peaceful flow. By the time the sun had climbed higher into the sky, ancient Egypt had fully settled into the steady shape of the day. The early softness of sunrise had passed. Morning was no longer new. It had become established. The light now spread evenly across the land, touching the Nile, the fields, and the clustered homes with a calm brightness that was strong but not yet overwhelming. For children, this part of the morning felt familiar and steady. It was the time when the world was fully awake, but still comfortable enough for movement and activity. Inside the homes, the morning routines had already been completed. Water had been used. Food had been shared. Spaces had been arranged for the day. Now life continued forward in its regular flow. Children moved through their surroundings in ways shaped by habit and observation. Some helped with small household actions. Some stayed nearby as adults worked. Some wandered into shaded areas close to home where play and quiet exploration could continue. There was no strict boundary between learning and living. Everything overlapped. A child watching someone weave or prepare food was learning. A child carrying something small across a space was learning. A child sitting quietly and observing the rhythm of movement around them was learning. Even silence held meaning in this world. Outside, the village was fully active now. Paths between homes carried steady movement. Not fast. Not chaotic. Just continuous. People went about their daily tasks with a sense of familiarity that came from repetition. The same kinds of actions happened each day, shaped by the needs of life along the Nile. The river itself remained central. Always present in the background of everything. Its slow movement influenced fields, homes, and the patterns of work that depended on it. Children grew up seeing this relationship constantly. water and land, sun and shadow, work and rest, movement and stillness. These were not separate ideas. They were parts of one continuous experience. As the morning progressed, the sun rose higher and the air began to warm again. The approach of midday was slow and expected. Nothing sudden marked its arrival. It simply came, as it always did. Inside homes, people adjusted naturally. Tasks were completed in advance when possible. Work slowed slightly as the warmth increased. Children felt this change in their own bodies as well. Energy shifted. Movement became more measured. The rhythm of the day gently prepared for another pause. But for now, life continued. Steady. Familiar. Balanced. In shaded spaces, children sometimes gathered again for quiet play or observation. Simple objects. Natural materials. Small actions shaped by imagination. Play was not separate from reality. It was built from it. A reflection of the world around them in soft, personal form. As the sun continued its path across the sky, ancient Egypt remained in motion, never rushing, never stopping, only following the calm and endless rhythm that shaped every child's day along the Nile. As the day continued to move forward, ancient Egypt remained steady in its familiar rhythm. The sun climbed higher, and the light across the land became stronger, spreading evenly over fields, homes, and the wide, open spaces that stretched along the Nile. But even in this growing brightness, nothing felt rushed. Life did not speed up. It simply continued. For children, this steady continuation was the only world they knew. Morning had already passed into full daytime activity, and everything now followed the well-known structure of daily life. Inside homes, small actions repeated themselves in quiet ways. Water was used when needed. Objects were moved and returned. Simple tasks were done without urgency. Children moved through this space naturally. Sometimes helping. Sometimes observing. Sometimes resting in shaded corners where the heat was softer and the light less direct. Even when they were not actively doing something, they were still part of the day's rhythm. Listening. Watching. Learning without words. Outside, the village remained active. Not in a loud or chaotic way, but in a steady and continuous flow. People moved along paths between homes, fields, and storage areas. Each movement had purpose, but it was never hurried. Everything felt connected to time itself rather than against it. The Nile continued its quiet presence through the center of it all. It did not change its pace. It did not react to the heat or the light. It simply flowed, as it always had. Children growing up beside it saw this every day. The river became a silent teacher of consistency. It showed that life moves forward not through force, but through continuity. As midday gradually approached again, the air began to warm more noticeably. The change was subtle at first. A slight heaviness in the air. A brighter intensity in the light. A slower pace in movement. People adjusted without needing to speak about it. This was part of understanding the land. Part of living with the sun rather than against it. Children, too, felt this shift naturally. Their activity became softer. Their movement less frequent. The rhythm of the day began to lean once again toward stillness. Not yet fully resting, but preparing. In shaded places, life continued in its quieter forms. Children might sit together or alone. They might play simple games using small objects or the ground itself. They might watch the movement of others nearby, learning from everything they saw. Nothing was separated. Everything was part of the same continuous experience. Even time itself felt less divided. Morning did not feel far from afternoon. Afternoon did not feel separate from evening. It all flowed together in one long, gentle sequence. Inside homes, the feeling of the day remained calm and steady. No sharp changes. No interruptions. just the gradual passing of time marked by light and shadow. As the sun continued its journey across the sky, ancient Egypt remained in balance with it. Children grew within this rhythm naturally. Not thinking about it, not analyzing it, simply living inside it. And as the day moved forward once more, the world along the Nile continued its endless, quiet cycle, steady, familiar, and deeply unchanging, like a breath that never stopped moving through time. As the sun slowly moved past the highest point of the day once more, ancient Egypt began its familiar shift. It was not a dramatic change. It never was. Instead, it was something gradual, something that could only be noticed if one paid attention to the feeling of time itself. The light, which had been strong and steady, began to soften just slightly. The air, which had been warm and still, started to feel a little more open again. The world was not becoming different. It was simply continuing forward. Inside homes, children who had been resting or sitting quietly during the warmest hours began to stir again. There was no clear signal. No announcement. Only a natural return of awareness, as if the body itself understood the rhythm of the day without needing instruction. A slow sitting up. A quiet glance around a familiar space. A return to gentle movement. The household also followed this shift. Not all at once, but gradually, like water filling space after a pause. Simple tasks resumed. Light movement returned. Objects were used again, then placed back where they belonged. Everything remained calm. Nothing felt rushed. Outside, the village mirrored this same pattern. Paths between homes became slowly active again. People moved in small numbers at first, then more steadily as time passed. Not in groups that felt crowded or loud, but in a continuous, flowing presence. Life along the Nile never felt separated from the land itself. It moved with it, shaped by it, in quiet agreement with its rhythm. Children, as always, remained deeply connected to this environment. Some followed older family members in small ways. Some stayed near shaded areas close to home. Some played quietly using whatever was available around them. Stones, sand, simple handmade objects. The ground itself. Play did not need complexity. It needed presence. It needed space to imagine within what already existed. As the afternoon continued, the sun slowly began its descent again. The strongest brightness softened into warmer tones. Shadows grew longer, stretching across paths and open spaces in familiar patterns. The village began to feel a little less intense, a little more open again. This was the return of balance after midday's heaviness. A familiar easing into the second half of the day. Inside homes, preparation for evening slowly began in subtle ways. Not as a separate event, but as a quiet continuation of the day's flow. Water might be checked again. Simple items gathered. Spaces gently organized. Children remained part of this rhythm. Sometimes helping. Sometimes observing. Sometimes simply being present within the movement of the household. There was comfort in repetition. Comfort in knowing that each day followed a path already understood. As the sun lowered further and the light became softer, ancient Egypt continued its unbroken cycle of daily life along the Nile. Everything moved forward. Everything stayed familiar. And the day, like all days before it, gently carried itself toward evening without pause, without urgency, and without ever truly ending. As the afternoon light began to fade further, ancient Egypt entered one of its most peaceful moments. The sun was lower now, no longer strong and high, but moving gently toward the edge of the horizon. Its light became softer, warmer, almost quiet in the way it touched the land. Shadows stretched longer across the sand, across the paths between homes, and across the still waters of the Nile. Everything seemed to slow without being told to slow. Inside the homes, children felt this change first in a subtle way. The energy of the day was no longer rising. It was settling. A natural easing, like the world itself was preparing to rest again. Families began to gather more closely. Not through effort, but through return. People came back from small tasks, from nearby movement, from scattered parts of the village, all slowly rejoining the shared space of the home. There was a quiet sense of completion in the air. The day had been lived. Now it was gently closing. Children often stayed close to their families during this time. Sitting nearby. Resting against familiar surfaces. Watching the slow movement of evening preparation. The household itself moved in soft patterns. Simple actions continued. Water placed away. Objects returned to their places. Small preparations for night arranged without hurry. Everything was calm. Everything familiar. Outside, the village also softened. Paths that had carried steady movement during the day now grew quieter. People returned to their homes in unspoken understanding. Work for the day was ending. Not abruptly, but gradually, like a tide moving out and leaving still water behind. The Nile continued its quiet presence through it all. Unchanged. Uninterrupted. Reflecting the fading light in long, gentle streaks that moved with its current. For children, evening carried a very specific feeling. A sense of winding down that was not sudden or forced, but natural. Like breathing out after a long day of movement, rest, and observation. Inside homes, food for the evening was shared in simple form. Bread. Grain. Whatever was available within the household. It was not about variety. It was about togetherness. Families often sat in shared space, close to one another, as the light outside continued to fade. Conversation, if present, was quiet. Soft. Unhurried. Sometimes there was silence instead. A comfortable silence that did not feel empty. As the sun approached the horizon, the sky began to change again. Warm tones deepened into richer colors. Orange softened into red, then into muted shades of dusk. The final light of the day stretched across the land in long, fading lines. Children felt this moment deeply, even if they did not speak of it. The end of the day was approaching. Not as an ending of life, but as a return to stillness. Inside the home, sleeping spaces were prepared slowly. Mats placed. Soft coverings adjusted. Belongings set in familiar order. Nothing rushed. Everything done in quiet readiness. Outside, the last visible light of the sun touched the horizon one final time before beginning to disappear. And as it did, ancient Egypt once again entered the soft boundary between day and night where movement fades, stillness grows, and the world prepares itself for rest beneath a calm and endless sky along the Nile. When night finally returned to ancient Egypt, it did not feel like a sudden change. It arrived the same way it always had. Slowly. Softly. Like a familiar rhythm settling back into place. The last colors of sunset faded from the horizon, leaving behind a deepening blue that gradually turned into the stillness of full night. The sky became wide and quiet again. Stars appeared one by one, scattered gently across the darkness, steady and distant, as if they had always been waiting there. Below them, the land became calm. The Nile River continued its movement, but in the dark it felt quieter, more subtle, as if the sound of its flow had softened into the night itself. Inside the homes, life had already begun to settle fully into rest. The final moments of evening had passed, and now there was only stillness. Children lay in familiar sleeping spaces. Mats placed on the ground. Simple coverings adjusted. Bodies resting close to family members in shared warmth. There was comfort in this closeness. Not just physical comfort, but emotional calm. A sense of safety that came from being together as the world outside grew dark and quiet. Voices had faded completely now. Conversation had ended long before. Even small movements had slowed and disappeared. The household now existed in a deep and steady silence. Not empty, but complete. Children drifted into sleep at their own pace. Some fell asleep quickly, already carried by the weight of the long day. Others remained half aware for a little while longer, listening to the faint presence of night around them. A distant wind moving across open land. The soft shifting of air through small openings in the home. The quiet sense of the world continuing beyond the walls. Sleep came gently. Naturally. Without force. In ancient Egypt, sleep was not a break from life. It was part of its cycle. A necessary return to stillness before the next beginning. Outside, the village was completely quiet. Paths between homes were empty. Work had ended long ago. Even the faint sounds of daytime life were gone now, replaced by the calm presence of night. The land itself seemed to rest. Yet nothing was truly stopped. The Nile continued its slow, constant movement through darkness. Unchanged by time of day. Unchanged by human activity. It flowed as it always had, carrying the land's quiet rhythm forward. As the night deepened, the sky above remained vast and still. Stars held their steady positions, marking time in a way that felt distant and unhurried. Children sleeping below them were unaware of this slow passage. Their dreams were simple. Shaped by fragments of the day. Light. Water. Movement. Family. Play. Rest. These impressions blended softly together in sleep, without sharp edges or separation. The world of dreams was not far from waking life. It was only another form of it. As hours passed, the night remained steady. No urgency. No interruption. Only continuation. And somewhere far beyond awareness, the sky began to shift again. A faint change at the edge of darkness. A soft thinning of night that hinted at return. Not yet visible. Not yet bright. But already beginning. Inside the homes, children and families slept deeply, wrapped in the calm certainty that the cycle would continue. Night would give way to morning. Rest would give way to waking. And the world along the Nile would begin again, just as it always had, in the same quiet and endless rhythm that shaped every day of ancient Egyptian life. The night over ancient Egypt did not feel empty. It felt full of stillness. A stillness that was not absence, but presence in its quietest form. The land rested beneath a vast sky where stars remained steady and unchanged, scattered across the darkness like distant points of memory. The Nile continued its slow movement through the silence, never stopping, never changing its rhythm. It carried the same calm flow it had held during the day, now simply hidden beneath night. Inside the homes, children slept deeply. Their bodies had settled fully into rest, shaped by the long and steady cycle of the day before. Breathing was slow. Even. Soft. The household around them remained still, sharing the same quiet space of sleep. There were no interruptions. No sudden sounds. Only the gentle continuity of night. And yet, even in this deep rest, the world was not frozen. Time continued forward. Very slowly. Very gently. The night itself moved like a long, quiet breath. Across the land, everything remained in place. Homes stood in their familiar positions along the Nile. Fields rested under darkness. Paths between villages lay empty and still. But nothing was truly paused. The cycle was always moving. Always continuing. And far on the horizon, beyond what could be seen from inside sleeping homes, the faintest shift began once again. It was not light yet. Not even close. Only a soft change in the depth of darkness. A subtle loosening at the edge of night. The beginning of what would become morning. Inside the homes, no one noticed this change. Sleep remained steady. Children remained wrapped in the comfort of rest, unaware of the slow transformation taking place outside. This was how life always moved along the Nile. Not through sudden moments, but through gradual return. Night never truly ended abruptly. Morning never truly began at once. Each always grew out of the other, quietly, without force. As time passed, the stillness of night continued. The river flowed. The stars remained steady. The land rested. And life, in its simplest and most natural form, continued without interruption. Children in their sleep moved gently through dreams shaped by the familiar world they knew. The river, the sun, the home, the sounds and sights of daily life. Nothing distant, nothing unfamiliar. Only fragments of what they lived every day, woven together in soft patterns of sleep. And somewhere beyond the edge of awareness, the cycle waited. Patient, unchanging, certain. Because in ancient Egypt, every night always held the promise of morning. And every morning always carried the memory of night. A rhythm without beginning. A rhythm without end. Only continuation. Only flow. Only the quiet, endless return of life along the Nile. Night in ancient Egypt never truly disappeared. It simply softened. As the long hours passed, darkness began to lose its depth in the quietest way, almost as if the sky itself was gently exhaling. The stars remained visible for a long time, steady and unchanged, but even they seemed to shift slightly in presence as the night moved forward. Below them, the land continued to rest. Homes along the Nile were still. Villages were silent. Children slept deeply, their bodies relaxed into the familiar comfort of shared space and quiet air. There was no awareness of time passing. Only rest. Only stillness. And yet, the world was already changing. Very slowly. Very gently. At the edge of the horizon, where land met sky, the darkness began to thin once again. It was not light yet. Not brightness. Only a soft loosening of night's hold. A quiet suggestion that something was preparing to return. Inside the homes, nothing had changed in appearance. Everything remained still. But sleep itself began to shift in the smallest ways. A child might turn slightly in rest. A breath might deepen or change rhythm. The body, without waking, responded to the world outside. This was the earliest connection to morning. Not through sight. Not through sound. But through presence. Outside, the Nile continued its slow movement through darkness, carrying the same steady flow it always had. The land remained quiet around it, fields and paths still resting under night's final hours. And then, almost imperceptibly, the first true sign of dawn appeared again. A faint brightness at the far edge of the sky. Not strong enough to illuminate anything, but enough to mark change. The return of morning had begun. Inside the homes, children remained asleep, unaware of the shift taking place beyond their walls. Their dreams continued gently. Shaped by familiar fragments of life, light, water, movement, home, family, and the quiet rhythm of daily existence. Nothing sharp. Nothing distant. Only the soft continuation of what they knew. As the horizon slowly brightened, the stars began to fade once more, not all at once, but gradually, as if stepping backward into the deepening light. Night did not break. It yielded. Slowly. Naturally. Like something returning to where it belonged. Inside the homes, the first signs of waking would come soon. But not yet. For a little longer, everything remained in rest. Everything remained in stillness. And the world along the Nile held itself in that quiet, in-between moment where night was ending but morning had not fully arrived, and life waited calmly for the next beginning to unfold again, just as it always had, and always would. The transition from night to morning in ancient Egypt was never a sharp moment. It was a slow unfolding, like fabric gently loosened in soft light. By the time the first true glow of dawn reached across the horizon, the land was already halfway between darkness and day. The sky had begun to shift into a pale, growing brightness. Not yet strong. Not yet fully formed. But unmistakably present. Stars faded further now, becoming faint outlines before disappearing into the light that was slowly filling the upper sky. The Nile reflected this change in a muted, quiet way, holding the early colors of morning as if remembering the night it had just carried through. Inside the homes, sleep was still present. Children remained resting, their bodies calm and steady, wrapped in the final moments of night's softness. The household was quiet. Not empty. Just deeply still. And then, gradually, life began to return. A child might shift slightly, becoming more aware of space and warmth around them. Another might breathe more deeply, as if sensing the change in the world outside. Without waking fully, the body already responded to morning's arrival. This was the beginning of awareness. Not sudden. Not forced. Just gentle return. As the light outside strengthened, the interior of home slowly brightened through small openings in walls or doorways. The glow of dawn entered softly, spreading across sleeping spaces without urgency. It touched the mats where children lay. It reached the walls that held the warmth of the previous day. It filled the quiet corners of the home with a pale, peaceful light. Soon, the first child would wake. Not all at once, but one by one. Each waking was quiet. A slow opening of eyes. A moment of stillness. A gradual return to the feeling of the day beginning again. There was no disruption. Only continuation. The world outside was already alive in its earliest form. The faint movement of people beginning to stir. The first sounds of daily life returning to the village. The soft presence of activity resuming near the river and fields. Everything was beginning again. But without noise. Without urgency. Inside the homes, families followed the same gentle rhythm they had followed every day before. Water would be used for washing. Simple food would be prepared. Clothing would be adjusted for the warmth of the growing morning. Children moved through these actions as part of the household flow, not separated from it. They were included in the rhythm of life itself. The river remained constant outside. As always, it did not rush to meet the morning. It simply continued its slow, steady path through the land, carrying both night and day within its movement. As the sun prepared to rise fully, the entire world of ancient Egypt stood once more at the beginning of another day. Not new in a sharp sense, but familiar. Reappearing. Returning. Like something that had never truly left. And so the cycle continued. Morning becoming day. Day becoming evening. Evening becoming night. Night becoming morning again. Endlessly. Quietly. Steadily. Along the Nile, where time did not feel like an ending but like a gentle, unbroken flow that carried everything forward without ever truly stopping. As the sun finally rose fully above the horizon, ancient Egypt entered the steady brightness of a new day. The light was now complete. No longer soft like dawn, and no longer deep like night, but fully present across the land. It touched everything at once. The Nile, the fields, the paths between homes, and the walls of small houses all reflected the same warm, steady daylight. There was no surprise in this moment. No disruption. Only continuation. Inside the homes, children were now fully awake. The transition from sleep to morning had already passed gently through them. They moved with the familiar rhythm of a day beginning again. Washing came first, as it always did. Water brought from store jars or nearby sources was used in simple, repeated motions. Faces were cleaned. Hands were rinsed. The body adjusted slowly to waking life. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was separated from routine. Clothing was adjusted next. Simple garments suited for the warm climate of the Nile Valley. Light linen, practical and familiar, worn again and again as part of daily life. Breakfast followed in its quiet simplicity. Bread, often the central part of the meal. Sometimes fruit. Sometimes small additions depending on what the household had. Children ate alongside their families, sitting close in shared space. There was no separation between child and adult life in structure. Only difference in responsibility. Outside, the village had already fully awakened. Movement along paths was steady and familiar. People moved between homes, fields, storage areas, and small workspaces. Everything followed a rhythm that did not need explanation. It was simply understood. Children became part of this movement in their own small ways. Helping with light tasks. Carrying simple objects. Observing household activity. Or staying near adults as work continued. Even when they were not actively doing something, they were still learning. Through presence. Through repetition. Through watching the world unfold around them each day. The Nile remained at the center of it all. Its flow never changed in speed or intention. It continued through morning, midday, and evening alike. A constant presence shaping fields, homes, and life itself. As the morning moved forward, the light grew stronger again. Shadows shortened. Heat slowly began to build. The familiar cycle of the day was already preparing for its next phase. But for now, everything remained in balance. Movement was steady. Life was calm. The world felt stable and continuous. Children lived within this rhythm without questioning it. It was not something they observed from the outside. It was something they lived inside of completely. A cycle that repeated endlessly. Not as repetition in a mechanical sense, but as a natural flow of existence. And so the day continued forward once more along the Nile, carrying with it the same quiet certainty it always had, morning unfolding into afternoon, afternoon into evening, and evening back into night, in a rhythm that never ended, only continued. As the morning continued to deepen, the light across ancient Egypt grew stronger and more settled. The early freshness of dawn had fully passed now. The sun stood higher, steady and watchful, spreading warmth evenly across the land. The Nile reflected this brightness in soft, moving patterns, its surface calm and unbroken as it flowed through fields and past small villages. Inside the homes, the rhythm of the day continued without change. Nothing needed to be announced. Nothing needed to be explained. Each movement followed naturally from the one before it. Children, now fully awake and part of the morning's flow, moved through their surroundings in quiet ways. Some stayed close to their families. Some followed older siblings or parents as they moved between small tasks. Others sat nearby, observing carefully, absorbing the rhythm of daily life without needing to speak or ask. Observation remained one of the most important parts of childhood. A child might watch how grain was handled, how bread was stored or prepared, how objects were used and returned to their place. Even the smallest action carried meaning through repetition. Nothing felt wasted. Nothing felt separate. Everything was part of a connected pattern. Outside, the village continued its steady movement. People walked along familiar paths, carrying tools, carrying water, carrying simple items needed for the day. The sound of footsteps on dry earth blended into the quiet background of life. There was no loud interruption, no sudden noise, only the gentle presence of people moving with purpose. Children sometimes stepped outside during these hours, staying close to the home or within shaded areas. The sun was becoming stronger now, and shade offered comfort. Under the side of a wall or near a tree, a child might sit or play quietly. Small objects became tools for imagination. Stones arranged into patterns. Pieces of wood placed carefully in the sand. Simple shapes formed and reformed again and again. Play did not require instruction. It emerged naturally from the world around them. Sometimes children played together in small groups. Other times, they remained alone, fully comfortable in their own quiet space. Solitude did not feel empty. It felt peaceful. A chance to observe the world more closely. To notice the movement of light. To feel the warmth of the air. To exist within the rhythm of the day without interruption. Inside the homes, small tasks continued. A parent might prepare something for later. A tool might be repaired. A container might be checked or moved. Children often watched these actions with quiet attention. Learning happened through seeing. Through repeating. Through being present. As the sun continued to rise higher, the air slowly began to grow warmer. The change was gradual. Almost unnoticeable at first. But it was always there. A slow build toward the midday hours that would come again, just as they always did. Children felt this shift in their own way. Their movement softened. Their activity slowed slightly. The body adjusted naturally, preparing for the stillness that would return later. But for now, the day remained open. Balanced between activity and rest. Between movement and quiet observation. The Nile continued its constant presence through it all. A steady flow that never changed. A quiet reminder that life itself moved forward in the same way, calm, continuous, and unbroken. And so the long warm hours of the day stretched gently across ancient Egypt, carrying children, families, and the land itself forward in the same peaceful rhythm that had shaped life along the river for countless generations. And so the days continued. Not just one day, or one season, but many. So many that they began to feel like one long, unbroken moment, gently flowing forward along the Nile. For the children of ancient Egypt, life was not something divided into sharp beginnings and endings. It was something lived slowly. Repeated softly. Felt deeply through simple moments. They woke with the sun, again and again. They washed their hands in cool water, again and again. They ate simple bread, sat beside family, walked along familiar paths, and rested when the heat grew strong. They watched. They listened. They learned without being told that they were learning. The world around them was their guide. The river, always moving. The sun, always rising and setting. The air, warming and cooling with quiet certainty. Everything repeated. But it never felt empty. Because within that repetition, there was comfort. There was stability. There was a kind of peace that did not need to be explained. A child would grow within this rhythm slowly. Not rushing toward anything. Not pulled forward by urgency. But simply becoming older, one day at a time, within the same calm pattern of life. Morning would come. Then midday. Then afternoon. Then evening. Then night. And then morning again. Endlessly. Gently. Like breathing. Homes would remain simple. Walls of mud brick holding warmth during the day and releasing it slowly at night. Mats laid down again and again for sleep. Objects used, placed, and used again. Nothing wasted. Nothing hurried. Families stayed close. Not separated by distance or distraction. Children sat near their parents. Watched their hands move. Listened to their quiet voices. Felt their presence as part of everyday life. Even silence felt shared. Even stillness felt full. Outside, the Nile continued its quiet journey. It did not change for one child or another. It flowed the same way it always had. A steady line through time. A constant that held the world together. Children grew beside it. Played near it. Watched its surface shift with light and shadow. And without needing to understand it fully, they lived within its rhythm. Seasons passed gently, almost unnoticed at first. The land would change in small ways. The air would feel slightly different. But the daily rhythm remained. Always returning. Always continuing. There were no loud endings. No sudden conclusions. Life did not stop and start. It flowed. Like water. Like time. Like the quiet movement of the Nile under the wide, endless sky. And in that flow, childhood existed. Simple. Calm. Steady. Filled with small moments that did not ask to be remembered, yet remained softly present. A child lying down at night would not think of the past in long stretches. They would feel the day as something close. Something gentle. Something that would return again in the morning. And so the story does not end. It slows. It softens. It becomes quiet. Like the final light of evening fading across the river. Like the last sound of footsteps settling into stillness. Like a breath, slowly leaving, and then returning again. Ancient Egypt remains there in that rhythm. Not gone. Not distant. But resting in a slow, endless cycle of days that never truly end. Only continue. Softly. Calmly. Forever along the Nile.